Hello, welcome to Crime Bytes, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz, and today is True Crime Tuesday. I'm excited. Well, I don't know if excited is the right word here, but do I have a good one? A wild one? A truly bizarre and beyond disturbing one for you today? From cults to pedophilia to polygamy to vampire Jesus. Vampire Jesus. This one has a little of everything. And if you thought some of our recent stories were wild, then buckle up because, whew. Before we do that, though, hello again. Hi, bonjour, jinqui. Sorry, we're just going to do a quick channel update. If you would like to skip this and hop right to today's story, you can jump right to this mark here. That being said, welcome to Crime Bytes again, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. I try and pick cases that make for interesting stories or cases with some good shock value, and it's been really interesting so far. I also try to coordinate my crimes by states, and in doing so, I found some wild trends like Ohio is pretty insane, no offense. Check my Ohio playlist if you don't believe me. Anyhow, at some point we will cover a crime from each state. I think we have 13 or so covered so far at this point, but today we are going back over to California or Western Florida. Sorry, I'm terrible. I actually love Florida and have had some amazing times there. I spent a year of my life flying there and it was really great, but the crime stories from Florida, unmatched. I mean, you can't deny they're some of the most wild crimes that occur there. I also find that I'm really gravitating towards women, particularly mothers who kill, so in the future, I'd like to do a whole separate day for that if the interest is there. I'm also working on an almost month-long marathon that will premiere this winter about a serial killer who terrorized children up near my neck of the woods. So stay tuned for that as well. And if you've made it this far with me, I know my angry shark at the end of my video always demands that you subscribe every week. But yeah, if you enjoy this type of content, crazy and bizarre true crime stories brought mostly in story form, please subscribe and leave a like when you like a video. It really helps my channel and my self-esteem. Kinda. Anyways, let me know also which cases you might want me to look into in the future. Anyhow, let's get into today's story, and let me start by introducing you to Marcus. Marcus was born on August 22nd, 1946 to Benjamin and Carrie Wesson. He was raised in a Seventh-day Adventist church. He would describe his father as an alcoholic and his mother as a religious fanatic. He was the oldest of 4 children. Apparently, both of his parents would beat him, and his father would also sexually abuse him. But his father would start up a relationship with one of Marcus's male cousins and basically run off with him. In the early 1960s, the family would move from Kansas to San Bernardino, California. He would drop out of high school and go join the Army in 1966. He was stationed in Europe as a medical orderly, where he would drive an ambulance. In 1968, he would leave the Army, and from there he moved to San Jose, California, where he would meet a woman named Rosemary Solario. She was in her 30s and had 8 children, but that didn't seem to bother Marcus, and you'll see why in a second. So he moves in with Rosemary and her 8 children, and in 1971, the pair would have a son of their own together. Now, our story starts to cross into the bizarre and disturbing at this point. The nasty. In 1974, Marcus would start sexually abusing Rosemary's 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. Then, when she turned 14, he would marry her in some sick home ceremony that he somehow convinced her mother to be okay with. I think at this point he had already begun some of his religious delusions that we're about to get into, but first let's just clarify what's going on here. He is now married, or fake married, to essentially his stepdaughter, who's now 14 and he is 34. 4 months after their wedding, Elizabeth would give birth to her first of 10 children that she would have with Marcus. 10. After the birth of their first child, Marcus would declare that the first of however many prophecies about himself was fulfilled. So yeah, you would think that would be enough bizarre and disturbing for one episode, but it gets much, much worse. On top of their 9 children, because one had died in childbirth, one of Elizabeth's younger sisters went on to have 7 children, and then she also went on to develop a drug issue that left her unable to care for them. So she decided that the best thing to do was to leave them in Marcus and Elizabeth's care. I have no idea why, but that happened. Marcus would constantly beat Rosemary's children along with his own, but at one point, one of Rosemary's sons would be so badly bruised that when they noticed during his gym class, the authorities were called. And at this point, Marcus would just grab Elizabeth and their children and flee. Marcus was unable to hold a steady job, so he would basically be receiving money for dependents, and they would be semi-nomadically living in rundown shacks, vacant houses, and even vacant boats. There's just so much going on here, but part of how it continued to go on for so long was that Marcus began homeschooling his children. He didn't allow Elizabeth to participate much in the homeschooling or parenting them, and he would teach them from his own Bible that he had written by hand. And it had some pretty interesting discrepancies from your everyday Bible, 2 in particular. The first was that he, Marcus Wesson, was God, and the second being that Jesus Christ was a vampire. I can't, but he was pretty insistent and even wrote literature about it, which he would, of course, homeschool his children with. I mean, in the story about the Passover, Jesus predicts his death and says, "This is my blood, this is my body," but they eat bread and drink wine, not actual blood or cannibalism. That's not taking place, and Marcus would use that and argue that it was. He went as far as to give his full family vampire names as well. His was Jevammarcuspire, which is a combination of Jesus, Marcus, and vampire. He wrote in his handwritten Bible that the key to immortality was drinking blood. So ponder that for a quick moment and what that could possibly imply. He also taught his daughters that they were preparing for Armageddon and that they were going to all be his wives when that happened. So, yeah, that's what he was teaching his kids. He also had a sex ed course that he taught his girls when they were as young as 8, with a highlight of oral sex and how to perform it on him. He would go on to rape at least 2 of his daughters and 3 of his nieces when they were as young as 8 as well, and all 5 of these girls would become pregnant. What a freaking mess. And again, just isolating these children from everything around them was what made this able to go on for so long. Apparently, when he began starting to attempt to have children with his children, Elizabeth, his first wife, if you will, because I just can't with all this incest here. But Elizabeth would attempt to stand up to him at this point, even trying to leave. But Marcus, who was at this point, he weighed around 300 pounds, he would choke her until she blacked out. He decided that because he was God, or something along those lines, he was going to have as many children as possible with as many women as possible, starting with his own children. So freaking nasty. On top of this, he would have them all on a really strict diet or eating what they could out of trash cans while he would get to go have some fast food and be 300 pounds. If his sons would do so much as sneak an extra spoonful of peanut butter, watch out, they're getting beat. They would also get beat for things as simple or as difficult as having the wrong vibe. So basically, if he wanted to beat you, he would beat you. Man. On top of this, he would do things like dig a grave and tell whichever child he was having dig it that it was for them. Can you freaking imagine that? It's like psychological torture. One of his sons would say, "He was all I knew. He was my dad. He was my God. I was mortally afraid of him. There were times as a child when I could not speak, when I would defecate in my pants, when I could not walk for a week because the beatings were so bad." In 1989, he would be charged with welfare fraud and perjury, and he would spend a brief period of time in jail. He was starting to have his older daughters get entry-level jobs, as well as bring him back any money that they made. And they were starting to figure out that the world wasn't quite exactly the way that their father had taught them all these years. On the day that everything blew up, 2 of Elizabeth's nieces would go back to where they were all living at the time in Fresno and demand that Marcus give them their children back. He was planning on moving everyone in his care at that time to Washington State and had apparently told these nieces that they didn't have to come, but he was taking their children with him. This led to the police being called. When they came, Marcus calmly ordered the older children to round up the younger ones and wait in the back room. Shortly after that, Elizabeth would arrive and head inside to see what was going on. At this point, the officers were also attempting to figure out what was going on. Elizabeth would head to the back room where she would see Marcus kneeling over their 17-year-old daughter, whose name was also Elizabeth, or Lacey. He looked at her and told her to come here, and she just bolted. She recalls, I just ran. To this day, I don't know why I ran or how I ran. To this day, I regret it. She says that her daughter didn't say anything, but just looked at her like it was too late. So Elizabeth, his first wife, bolts and leaves him with his daughter and his other sons and daughters and grandsons and daughters. I just can't even with that. Elizabeth will claim that because she didn't protect her children, that she will never have peace. And that's just so sad. Poor girl. Because what would happen next? The police were right there. Obviously, I would assume that if they thought that that was going to happen, I believe they would try to stop it. Some rapid shots rang out. And after about a 2-hour standoff, Marcus would calmly emerge from the house covered in blood. The police would enter after detaining him, and the crime scene was so gruesome that many of the responding officers and personnel would be placed on administrative leave and receive counseling. They would find 9 bodies, 7 children ages 1 to 8, and 2 women ages 20 and 17. They were all shot through the right eye except for Sabrina, who was shot in the left eye from a vertical angle. They were found in a bedroom full of coffins, stacked in a literal pile. What the heck? So this incident occurred on March 12th of 2004. How many of you guys remember this case? Now, how many of you guys remember the Lacey Peterson and Scott Peterson case? He was on my Diabolical Daddy list last year. I'll leave a link in the description here for that video if you're unfamiliar or if you would like to watch it. Anyhow, that case was playing up to Scott's trial in November of 2004. It was everywhere, and this case wasn't all over the place. It didn't seem to have as much impact to me in the news anyways, and I remember the Peterson case really well from it being all over the news and how sad it was when we ultimately found out what happened to Lacey. Anyhow, some other people have noticed that as well and made comments that it could be race related, as Marcus Wesson and his family are Black and Hispanic. What do you guys think about that? I mean, the point does not seem to be invalid. Please do remember to be kind if you do drop a comment along those lines. While on trial, Marcus would attempt to say that his daughter Sabrina was the actual killer, and they would consider this because she did have gun residue on her and she was found at the top of the pile of bodies and the gun was found underneath her. But ultimately, various surviving members of his family would attest that he had a whole murder-suicide pact drilled into them. So it would be plausible that Sabrina could have physically pulled the trigger. Would this make Marcus inculpable, though? I would say that it would not, and even if she physically pulled the trigger, that he is still just as guilty because he forced her to mentally. Marcus was ultimately convicted of 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 sex crimes, including the rape of his daughters in June of 2005. And he is still on death row in San Quentin. He would be 77 at this point, and he will probably die before he is ever executed. Especially because as of right now, there are 689 inmates in California awaiting execution, but there has been a stay on the death penalty in California since 2019. Inmates are still on death row, and if they do reinstate lethal injection, they will need to adapt a new protocol before putting it into practice. So we'll see. Wow, guys, there's so much. What do you think about this one? Anyhow, as we always do, let's try to end this week on a more positive note. I don't know if you could officially call today's story a cult story. It was probably too small to be an actual cult, but it definitely had all of the elements, or some of them there, and we know it would have became one if Marcus could have gathered a little more interest. So it got me wondering what resources may be available to people who are looking to get out of a cult or a cult-like environment, because really they're kind of more prevalent than you would imagine on various levels, of course. So for today's positive highlight, we're going to look at Cult Escape. Cult Escape is primarily a resource website created by John Spinks, who shares his own experience about leaving the exclusive Brethren cult. John did leave, and in doing so, lost his family, and now he shares his story and runs this website to attempt to help other people know that they are not alone and that there is hope and a better life for them available on the other side of whatever cult or cult-like experience that they may find themselves in. You can check out the website, which includes John's story, a list of other related resources that John has compiled, at cultescape.com. Cultescape.com. Even take a test to see if you are in a cult, in case you were wondering. There is also a section where people who have left a cult give advice to people who are just leaving a cult, and for some reason I particularly like that part, so I'm going to share a few of these pieces of advice before we go in no particular order. People on the outside are a lot nicer than you think. Don't pretend that life in the cult didn't happen. I tried that and I know from experience that it's not healthy. Just take your time, realize that it's okay to have had bad days, but the good days will quickly outweigh the bad. Be gentle on yourself. Give yourself time to readjust, to find out who you are before making huge decisions. Stop judging yourself. Take time figuring out who you are. Don't make important decisions, relationship, job, home, etc. for a year at least, if you can manage that. Your idea of who you are will change in that year. Do your research and read books. Ask, what does an absolute truth have to fear from a thorough investigation? Some of these are just fantastic advice that could be used for a variety of situations. I will leave it here. If you would like to read more of those, head to cultescape.com. I'm going to try and bring you one of my big fish stories next week. He was a dad under some interesting circumstances, to say the least. So stay tuned. And until then, please stay safe out there. Bye.